This is live from Lodi Garden, a conversation about the world, sitting in a 15th century garden in New Delhi, the capital of India. Your host is the award-winning historian, Hindol Sengupta.
I'm Hindol Sengupta and this is live once again from Lodi Garden. My guest today is a very special man. He's a veteran soldier, a scholar and one of the foremost minds thinking about India's security issues. I'm joined by Admiral Raja Menon. Admiral Menon, thank you very much for joining me.
Not at all. Good morning. And I think this is a very fine way of spending the morning. The weather gods have been kind. It's nice and cool outside. And the amalthas is in bloom.
Indeed. It's a fine morning in Delhi and absolutely the right time to begin by asking you some of the most urgent questions on Indian security issues.
Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to begin by referring to an article you recently wrote. You spoke about how India's move to build a comprehensive naval base in the Andaman and Nicobar as a bold and imaginative move to counter China. Could you, to begin with, take us through what you meant and why this is a bold and imaginative move?
Well, I was referring to the fact that we are, although not very openly, building a base in the Great Nicobar. The Great Nicobar is the southernmost island of the Andaman and Nicobar chain. And from Great Nicobar, the northern tip of Indonesia is only about 100 miles. So the entire traffic of the Indian Ocean is funneled through these 100 miles. And if we can dominate the exit and the entrance to the Malacca Straits, then we acquire a certain amount of power which goes well beyond our economic status. And I was suggesting that particular measure because I feel sorry to see that in the Himalayas we are fighting not so much Chinese as we are fighting geography. The Chinese are situated on a level plateau in the Tibetan area and they have built, of course they're very good at infrastructure, and they've built a 6-lane highway from the Burma-India-China tri-junction to the Aksai Chin. So on this 6-lane highway, they can move troops laterally, mountain acclimatized troops, so quickly that today, to the surprise of most Indians, the Chinese army is smaller than the Indian army. And they are able to keep us guessing as to where they are going to create the next offensive. So I think looking at the problems of the army, the Navy can do much more, much more, if given a chance. And if we can control the Malacca Straits, then we have a stranglehold on the jugular of China, because 64% of Chinese oil is in the Indian Ocean, and all 64% has to pass through the Malacca Strait. So if we can threaten the Chinese oil in the Malacca Strait, they will think twice about creating an offensive in the Himalayas. So I was suggesting, in fact this was part of a larger paper, of reorienting our grand strategy from a defensive land-based strategy to an offensive oceanic strategy.
And that's my next point that I want to come to. Explain to us what you mean by that. Number one, a lot of people, there's still an argument whether India has a grand strategy or not. What is India's grand strategy? Indeed, what is India's security strategy? There's a lot of debate on whether India still has a comprehensive, grand strategy or a comprehensive military and security strategy. If we don't have a defined one, why don't we still do have one? And my other question is, when you talk about moving it from a land-based imagination to an oceanic imagination, what do you mean? What are the key pillars of this reorientation?
Well, um, you know, we are the fifth largest economy in the world today. And it's not far off, and we are the fastest growing large economy. So it's not far off when we will become the third largest economy. When we do, despite the low per capita income in India, we will be among what might be called one of the great powers. Now, what is a great power? A great power is a power that influences geopolitics well beyond its borders. I mean, today, if you ask the question, who is the most supreme military geographical power in the Indian Ocean, it is the United States. That's because of the United States Navy, not because of the United States Army. It's because of the US Navy. So once we get into the big league, people are going to look at India to say, what power projection capability does this country have? And today, we have none. If we become the third most powerful nation in the world, we will still be spending 65% of our defense budget on just protecting our territory. Now that's ridiculous, because we have a historical bent about protecting territory, because we were given the map of India by the British in 1947. And immediately, Pakistan tried to take off a chunk in Kashmir. China decided to try and take off a chunk in the northeast. So we have this paranoia about losing territory. But mature countries don't worry about that. Nobody in France believes that a part of France is going to be lost. Or no modern country believes that a part of its territory is going to be lost. So spending money on territorial integrity, which is what our Defense Minister Rajnath Singh keeps talking about, is faintly ridiculous, especially if we become a big power. What is going to count is our power projection capability, and that is our maritime strength. So we have to reorient our grand strategy. But of course, you're quite right saying, do we have a grand strategy? We don't have a grand strategy. But more importantly, well, we have a faint grand strategy in the sense of foreign policy that goes beyond the borders of the country. That we were given by Jawaharlal Nehru. But we don't have a military policy based on a national security strategy, for the simple reason that for many years we never had a National Security Council. And when I was of the rank of a Commodore, some of us from the three services, the Army, Navy and the Air Force, were put together in an organization called the Defense Planning Group.
That's right.
To write a National Security Council, or write about the need for a National Security Council. And we wrote it. And we got one. But unfortunately, we have made poor choices in leading the National Security Council. The Secretary to the National Security Council is a National Security Advisor. And in the initial stage, we've had 5 National Security Advisors so far. The first one was Brajesh Mishra. special secretary to the Prime Minister carried a lot of clout.
Yeah.
And he could have done great things. But I'm sorry to say that successive national security advisors, except for Shiv Shankar Menon, have produced no written document. During Shiv Shankar Menon's time, we produced a document called Non-Alignment 2.0.
That's right.
At least that was an attempt to write a document. But no written work seems to emanate from the National Security Advisor or the National Security Council. So where our national security planning should be, I think there is a dark hole. And this needs to be filled by choosing people of great intellectual eminence who can produce decades worth of backlog of written material. One of them, of course, as you say, is the national security strategy.
I also want to talk a little bit about, since you're talking about reorienting to an oceanic imagination, there's been a lot of talk in the recent past about how the Indian Ocean is India's ocean, so to speak, right? Now, of course, we are seeing rejuvenated efforts to engage the Pacific. There was the Fiji visit recently, a much talked about visit of the Prime Minister, to the Pacific. How do you see all of these things?
Well, as I said, geography favors some countries and is very harsh on some countries. Geography is very harsh on India as far as our northern border is concerned. But geography is very harsh on China as far as her maritime inheritance is concerned. I mean, you look at the shape of China, it's like a long rectangle with only one short side exposed to the sea. The other is all landlocked.
Yeah.
So what China is doing is trying to overcome its poor geographical inheritance.
Yes.
By reaching out.
Yeah.
And where can it reach out to but to the oceans of the Pacific Islands?
Right.
So there is a need to counterbalance the Chinese attempt to acquire bases, places, and ports outside China to improve her geographical position. So, and we need to help the Americans counter that, because so far there is the beginning of what might be called a second pole.
Yeah.
Consisting of China, Russia, and a whole group of countries. I don't think it's going to be successful, because one of the countries in this pole is Russia.
Yeah.
And Russia, in my opinion, is a declining power. Its GDP is half of India's. Most Indians would be greatly surprised to hear this fact. Its demography is declining. It lost something like 7 to 8 million people in the last decade. And it is generally dependent on the sale of petrochemicals.
Yes.
So that pole is not going to become a very strong pole. It's like, I would compare that alliance, the Chinese-Russian alliance, to the alliance between Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler, one of the great blunders that he did was to ally himself with Mussolini and thereby take on all Mussolini's weakness, inept army, overambitious foreign policy, and all that. I mean, this is similar to that. So we need to help the Americans, which we are doing with the Quad. The Quad is essentially a foreign policy club. It has no military heft.
And you believe it should have a little bit of military help?
It should have a military heft. It should have a military heft for the simple reason that there is currently a revolution in military affairs. And that revolution consists of gaining information dominance
Yeah.
over the battle space. And that can only be done through exchange of information even during peacetime. So when the Quad meets, if you notice, either the foreign minister meets or the prime minister meets. There is no military representative from the Quad nations
Yes.
that meet. That is a great weakness.
Since you mentioned the second pole, sir, let me ask you, there is also talk about the rejuvenation, in a sense, of India as the leader of the global south. We just heard in the Pacific, this extraordinary language, in a sense, that, the Pacific will rally behind India, right? What do you make of that? Could there be this sort of, if I may say, a third pole of India as the leader of the global south?
I am a believer in Morgenthau, Hans Morgenthau,
Yes.
who wrote on foreign politics. And he is, in many ways, the founder of the realist school.
Yes.
So, any clubbing of nations is going to be successful depending on their economic clout. A collection of poor nations will remain just that, a collection of poor nations. If India wants to be generous and distribute its military power, it's first got to acquire that military power, which you can't do if you spend 70% protecting your territory. So if you have an oceanic strategy and you do become the third largest GDP in the world, and then you want to create a global south, then I think there are chances of success.
I also want to ask you, since you mentioned the Quad and how it should have a military element, according to you, you've also written that India, in a sense, should build a nuclear collaboration with Japan, especially in nuclear submarines. Take us through that thought process.
Well, what's happened is that a lot of people are thinking, what is the next war going to be like? And we are getting small hints from the way the Ukraine war is going. I mean, when Russia threatened to invade Ukraine, the world in general, and I included, thought that Ukraine would be overrun in 5 days. That hasn't happened because warfare has undergone another change. And a lot of weapons that were thought to be fearsome are not of practical use anymore. If you notice, there is no air-to-air combat in the Ukraine war. The density of surface-to-air missiles has made the use of air power a very problematic thing. So, all I can say is that it seems that in the future war, the one platform that is going to be unbeatable is the nuclear submarine. The nuclear submarine is a queen of the sea already today. But in the future, it is going to become even more so. And power projection is going to rest on the back of large aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. Our nuclear submarine program is going, frankly, badly. We have built the Arihant, which is true. But no country takes 4 decades to build a sea-based deterrent, which is what we are in the process of achieving. A sea-based deterrent in 40 years of building. So we need help, which BARC is unable to provide in the form of miniature nuclear reactors, having high uranium core. That is the specialty of only the United States Navy. But most of the United States nuclear submarine core were built by Westinghouse. And Westinghouse has gone bankrupt and been bought over by Toshiba. So there is a possibility of allying ourselves with Japan for the sake of trying to build a collaborative, high nuclear uranium enriched reactor for nuclear submarines with Japan. So that is the collaboration that we need with Japan. And I partly blame the government and the Foreign Office for not seeing the possibilities of collaborating with Japan. Diplomatic alliances go only so far. Behind it, there's got to be a military operational plan, which is today lacking between India and Japan.
As we come to the end of our conversation, sir, I would have two last points to ask you. One is, there's been a lot of talk in the recent past about India becoming a great power of the future. Now, for many years, we kept on hearing that India was a rising power. Now, I guess to a degree we have risen. Now there's talk about us being a great power. What do you think about that? Will India become a great power? Should India try and become a great power? Number two, great powers traditionally have had a grand narrative, one that they tell themselves inwardly towards their domestic consumption, but also to the external world. America was a city upon a hill, so to speak, and so on and so forth. The UK had a civilizing mission,
yes,
and so on and so forth, right? So what is our grand narrative? People like Kanti Bajpai and others tried to decipher what our grand narrative is maybe a decade ago or something like that. But there's never been consensus on what India's grand narrative is and what it should be. So I put to you today two questions, sir. Number one, is India a potential great power? Should it try to become one? And number two, if yes, what should India's grand narrative be?
I think it is inevitable that India will be given the option to be a great power. And this is mostly because, look at the numbers. Whatever problems there may be in our economic growth, we are easily going to reach 5 trillion.
Yes.
And with a bit of luck, we're going to reach 10 trillion. With an economy of 10 trillion, you'll more or less be handed over the position of a great power on a plate. At that stage, your question is very apt. Do we have a narrative? In this, we have two choices. One is to craft a grand narrative all over again. The other is to try and look back on any time in our history when we were a great power. And I think that there was a time, long neglected in Indian history, when India was a great power. And that was in the time of Raja Chola.
Absolutely. I was about to. It is during the Cholas. Absolutely.
The Cholas.
Yes.
I mean, we tend to be shy,
Yes.
about our Southeast Asian connection,
Correct.
on the grounds that we were ruled by a colonial power, and we don't want to give the impression that we were a colonial power ourselves. But our civilization reached up till Da Nang,
That's right.
where one of the great tourist sites are the Hindu temples.
That's right.
In Vietnam. And if you look at an attempt to physically draw the map of what was the Indian influence, it is staggering. So there is a historical narrative available to us.
Absolutely.
But should we want to neglect that and craft a new one? That's up to us. And I don't think we will stray very far from where Raja Chola went. With a 10 trillion economy, the fact is, countries today like the United States, Russia, China, India, spend about 2% of the GDP on the military. And that will remain. But 2% of 10 trillion is a fearsome amount. And provided we don't pour all that money down a rat hole by trying to defend the Himalayas, where frankly speaking, our case is not very strong, especially in Aksai Chin. But to make a border adjustment is virtually impossible in New Delhi because no parliament is prepared to give and take. They are all prepared to take. Nobody is prepared to give. There will be a furor if there is a border adjustment. So the border problem is going to stay with us as long as we have an enlightened majority government which is willing to take the risk. Once we do that and we create an oceanic strategy, then we will have a narrative. But what we will still lack is the paperwork. The paperwork has got to come from the National Security Council. And the National Security Council has got to be staffed by more eminent people. And when this happens, we will have an alternative narrative should we wish to ditch the Chola Empire strategy.
Fascinating. Of course, today we are seeing the Chinese claim, their own history in the Indian Ocean, and in a sense, the competition between India and China has become between the histories of the Cholas.
Yes.
And there, they have this admiral called Jiang He.
Yes.
They say that he did these 7, great
That's
armada,
right.
journeys and so on and so forth. Fascinating. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I completely agree with you that if India has to build a grand narrative, one absolutely ought to look at the Cholas. It's not so far away. I think it was only 2013 or 2014 when we celebrated the 1,000-year coronation of Raja Chola.
Right.
But thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate your time. Great pleasure, sir.
It's made me think.
Thank you, sir. It's made me think too, and thanks for your time.
You were listening to Live from Lodi Garden with Hindol Sengupta. This is a Global Order presentation, edited and produced by Koteshwar Rao.